It is 7:33 on Tuesday, February 15th, and I'll call the meeting of the Light Board Advisory Committee to order. And today we have minutes to approve, which we're doing later in the meeting because we're kicking off the meeting with a presentation from Dave Kavanaugh at the New England Energy New England, excuse me, and about talking about the Northeastern pool, electricity pool. So, Craig, do you want to do any more intro?
As you said, so Dave comes our way as our vendor with Energy New England, represents us at NEPOOL, but as well, he sits on the board of NEPOOL. He's the chair. And Dave, is it the participants committee or is it just NEPOOL as a whole?
It's a participants committee. I can do a brief intro to help level set folks. I haven't met many people other than Michael and you. Yeah, Dave Kavanaugh, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Market Affairs, Energy New England. Energy New England is a service provider and a consultant and advisory service for many municipal systems. We also manage some merchant energy in Maine. Energy New England does, back office settlement, bidding and scheduling, regulatory work. Certainly work in the State House through our E&E strategies. We also provide EV programs for many communities, and as well as energy efficiency programs. And we do a lot of contracting services for the municipal systems. We represent about 26. By way of my history, I've been in the business about 37 years. Spent 15 years with Northeast Utilities, now Eversource. And in that role, actually operated coal plants, gas plants, oil plants, had some nuclear maintenance background. Then on to ISO New England, where I spent 13 and a half years as a director of market services. One of my roles was to make sure we know how to register demand response for the first time ever in the market, actually measure it, audit it, verify its existence, basically serve as the interface to the market for many different products and services. Later on, I went to work for, again, for Eversource in their demand reduction area, managing all the capacity market interface for the demand response resources and conservation load management. And then to E&E for my first stint as their only and first regulatory person to start their regulatory services. Then off to NRG as their director of New England markets, energy power marketing, where I manage their interface with New England markets, as well as developing power plants such as Canal 3 out on the Cape, the new gas turbine. I was involved in that development project. Now I'm back to E&E as their regulatory person again. I've been there about 3 or 4 years, again, managing all the interfaces with the marketplace, with FERC, serve as the NEPOOL participants chair, publicly owned entity, vice chair sector under the NEPOOL Stakeholder Process. So a little background for me. And then today, Craig asked me to come and speak to a couple of things that have come recently through the stakeholder process that I presume you're well aware of. And if not, we'll get into some of the details here and have a brief presentation on 2 topics, Order 2222 and the MOPR changes that are recently voted. And glad to take questions along the way. And if there's any questions, I'll just kick off the presentation, but I'll pause here to see if folks have any comments or questions. All right, so I'm going to put the share screen on, and you can tell me if you can see it, because I have 3 screens on this end, and I want to make sure I'm seeing what you're seeing. So is the presentation showing?
It says it has started, but nothing's up yet.
Says I'm sharing my screen.
There we go.
Okay, great. So let's go. So that's the first screen you're seeing?
Regulatory update, Belmont Advisory Board.
Great, yes. Thank you. So again, today we're going to talk about Order 2222 and the minimum offer pricing rule, and I'll get into the details of each. Please stop me as you need to. I'm going to move right along. So Order 2222, FERC order designed to remove barriers of participation for distributed energy resource aggregations in ISO and RTO wholesale markets. DERs are, storage units, demand response, behind the meter generation, a multitude of the distributed energy resources we're seeing enter and being used in both on a residential setting, retail setting, and then certainly on the C&I commercial industrial setting. It was issued in September of 2020. NEPOOL kicked off its process in December of 2020. An ISO compliance filing date set by the FERC under compliance order was July 19, 2021. After consideration, the ISO submitted a request to move that date out, the filing date for compliance, and that was set for February 2, 2022. So you look at the key compliance directives under Order 2022, there's 11 of them. And it's to allow distributed energy resource aggregations to participate directly in ISO and wholesale, ISO and RTO markets, and to establish a DER aggregators as a type of participant. The participants are parties that are subject to the agreements of the ISO. You join the ISO through signed agreements, market participant agreements. You agree to participate and follow all the governing documents of the marketplace. You also join NEPOOL through a second VIII NEPOOL agreement. The DER, distributed energy resource participant, wasn't yet created, and so that had to be created. It allows DER aggregators to register distributed energy resources under one or more participation models that accommodate the physical and operational characteristics of distributed energy resource aggregations. So imagine you have a bunch of either heterogeneous or homogeneous resource types, and you can mix them into a single market representation for participation in the market. Also required to address the size requirements of DERAs or individual distributed energy resources. Address local requirements for DERAs, address distribution factors and bidder parameters. Distribution factors are what's in the model when they dispatch the system. It is how they consider where they are to setting price. It's one of the factors in setting price in the market. Address information and data requirements for DERs as well. Address metering and telemetry requirements for DERAs. Establish market rules on coordination between RTOs, ISOs, DER aggregators, distribution utilities, and relevant electric retail regulatory authorities. Address modifications to the list of DERs, DRA. Address market participant agreements for DER aggregators, and implement the opt-in provision for distributed energy companies with 4 million megawatt hours or less of annual sales. There is no public power system in New England that has 4 million megawatt hours or more of sales. So all public power systems must opt in to participate in Order 2222. This is similar to the Order 719 provisions that came out about 15 years ago. That too has an opt-in provision that allows demand response participation within systems that are 4 million megawatt hours or less of sales. So that's the high level of the 11 parameters under which compliance was instructed to make changes. The ISO to make changes in documents, then file with the FERC. Travis, I see you coming off mute.
Yeah, Dave, I just want to, so this might be the first time I've really taken a look at a FERC order or as such. And so this is the way the language is, they just kind of give, hey, ISO, please come up with a new policy that speaks to these 11 things. Yeah,
it's certainly got a lot more words wrapped around it. This is just the 11 objectives that are carved out of the compliance order. If you look at the order itself, it's certainly more voluminous.
Thank you.
You bet. I think if you look at the actual ISO filing that was submitted, it's like 16 or 1700 pages. And that is primarily because it's the tariff with the appropriate red line changes incorporated with it. And then the front end, it has the introduction, what was asked of them, what they did about compliance. It'll describe some of the back and forth in the stakeholder process, and ultimately what they're filing with the commission. But they're usually quite voluminous. They vary in size. So we, of course, in New England, we have a stakeholder process. The participants committee and the NEPOOL committees are the FERC-approved stakeholder process. And under the agreements between NEPOOL and ISO, all market rule changes and governing document changes must come through NEPOOL for consideration and debate prior to being enacted, either through a FERC filing. In the case of planning procedures and operating procedures, those are just voted on by the committee and enacted right away through an approval of the committee. Again, tariffs and market rules are for governed documents and must be filed with the commission for a ruling as to whether they are, you'll hear this term J&R, just and reasonable. There's many views of just and reasonable, but J&R means it's met a standard of just and reasonable and affects rates, terms, and conditions when it affects market pricing. So in the stakeholder process, ISO and stakeholders spent over a year discussing the requirements of Order 2222 and the associated government document revisions. They went through a couple technical committees, the transmission committee, the reliability committee, and the markets committee. Really, the markets committee is where a bulk of the discussion took place. ISO accepted certain stakeholder feedback for inclusion in its final governance document to be filed with FERC. Stakeholder process, ISO comes forward with its compliance design. Stakeholders are allowed to question the design, look for tweaks to that design, bring their, if you will, for lack of a more elegant description, boots on the ground view as to how things might be impacting their business or their ability to comply. And ISO will make adjustments at times, sometimes they won't. Advanced energy economy members developed 7 amendments to the ISO proposed design for stakeholder consideration. AE amendments were offered at the December 2021 NEPOOL Markets Committee. The amendments failed to get support needed of 60% by NEPOOL members, as they range from 26 to 40% is what their approval rating was. The NEPOOL Markets Committee supported the ISO design 71% across the sectors. I'm just going to move my laptop because I'm blocking one of my screens. So when you look at the NEPOOL process, you have the subcommittees, which are the technical committees, transmission, reliability, and markets. A number of both of the changes came to the markets committee. As Michael knows, there's an opportunity for participants to bring their amendments through to amend a proposal, and that gets voted on. And having done it many times myself, it's an onerous process, and sometimes you get one through, sometimes you don't. AE members brought through a host of changes that were considered. They didn't receive support. So now we move on, after we have the markets committee action, we move on to the top committee, NEPOOL Participants Committee, for final action. And what happens is the NEPOOL Markets Committee signals to the Participants Committee, hey, 71% of folks supported the ISO proposal. It comes as a supported recommendation to the Participants Committee. AE and their members could bring their amendments forward, even though they didn't get recommended support from the Markets Committee. They can proposals again at the Participants Committee. It's allowed for. So pause there, see if there are any questions before I move on to NEPOOL Participants Committee action. All right. So we moved on from the December vote on Order 2022 to the January 6th NEPOOL Participants Committee vote. And so in January 26th, the NEPOOL Participants Committee meeting, AE didn't bring forward its seven amendments. It really doesn't have to. NEPOOL is looking at the fact that the AE members have spent time in the process, talked to people, brought forward their amendments for consideration. The amendments were considered by the NEPOOL members, didn't receive support, but for all intent and purpose, it has completed the process. And why is that important? Because if in fact AE decided to go to FERC and say, look, we brought these amendments forward and we didn't get support, but we have all these other ideas we want to talk about too, then NEPOOL will say, well, wait a minute. You talked about your amendments and we hear those, and that's fine. You complete that process, you got your feedback. But these other things you didn't talk about, you're now bringing them up outside the process. And we're going to say that, you know, we have a FERC defined process, you didn't bring them up. We're going to object to that. But in this case, NEPOOL signal that, look, you did due diligence, you brought your amendments through the process, they didn't receive support, but you've completed the process. And if you file any protests at the commission based on the ISO's filing, we'll have no issues with that. We'll say you've done all your due diligence and you're staying consistent with what you discussed in the process. So AE members came to the PC meeting, got that acknowledgement from NEPOOL and didn't bring their amendments forward. It's a common practice, and it just means that they didn't choose a vote at the PC meeting. So the ISO order at the January meeting was voted by NEPOOL members, and it received broad support across. You can see the voting at the bottom here across all sectors. Various sectors had stronger support, other sectors had lower support, but it received support across all the sectors. passed, I believe, like 71% was the final vote at the PC meeting. Public Power didn't support the amendments in the MC vote for a number of reasons. You know, we had what we saw as settled issues. It was order 745 to talk about net benefit tests, how projects are evaluated in the marketplace. FERC had already ruled that resources should be measured at the retail point of interconnection, so the system sees the benefit in the wholesale market at that point of retail interconnection. Some proposals we liked. You know, there was a proposal on should a resource be able to participate not only in the capacity market, but could it participate in the real-time reserve market. Real-time reserve markets have specific definitions of how they function. The proponent also was looking to, I believe, provide some regulation service. I commented on behalf of E&E clients that, look, it's a good idea. We just don't have enough information about it. And it was kind of not well developed, so we didn't support that. So Public Power didn't support any of the amendments. Some we thought were intriguing, but we saw there was issues of, you know, double counting, settled matters with FERC, sub-metering for us, or who could be a reader. May sound pretty, you know, simple, but when you look at settlement in the ISO system, you have defined meter readers, close persistent assigned meter readers, people that read meters and report to ISO settlement. There's timelines, and we are subject to those timelines. And if the metering goes bad, if it's reported incorrectly, we have settlement problems. And having handled this for years in various capacities, it can be simply thousands of dollars or millions of dollars if it goes bad. So we supported that the host participant assigned meters continue to manage that function. But there was a range of proposals. They didn't receive support from us and others, but just wanted to be transparent on that. I'll pause there, see if there are any comments or questions.
Steve, could you please unpack just a little bit? You and I think are familiar with sort of what the generation or transmission supplier sector, what are the other sectors and sort of who would compose those voting blocks, please?
Great question. So in New England, FERC approved six sectors that compose the stakeholders in the region. As Michael just mentioned, we have the generator sector, which you can imagine is NRG, my former company. You have Vistra, Calpine, well, Calpine's the supplier sector, Dynegy. You have big power generators in that sector. Transmission is the IOUs, investor-owned utilities, Eversource, National Grid, Avangrid, PSNH, UI, United Illuminating. It's the host transmission providers, 5 of them that are in that sector. We have the supplier sector, which can be generators. Some generators in the supplier sector because they have generation and they serve load. And that would be also folks like Direct Energy that serves retail load and other suppliers of that type. Publicly owned entity sector is the municipal systems or co-ops, 59 or so out of the 74 that are in New England are represented in that sector. Alternative resource sector is solar developers, wind developers, demand response, storage resources, primarily in that sector. The end users are NGOs, Environmental Defense Fund, National Resource Defense Council, Mass AG, consumer councils for various state entities, and certainly end users that receive a bill in the region and can participate as an end user in that sector. You'll see a lot of main entities in there as well that have chosen to participate directly, businesses that have chosen to participate directly in the wholesale market instead of getting their services through other providers. So that's the range of participants in the NEPOOL process. Again, 6 sectors that are set by FERC, representing, you know, if you really unpack it, there's about 520 members in NEPOOL, covering a wide range of entities. hopefully that's helpful. Michael, you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good description. It's just, I think every time I talk to someone who's not necessarily deeply engaged, it's some of the names are more descriptive, some of them are less descriptive. But thank you, Dave.
Oh, you bet. You bet.
And Dave, the percentages there, does that mean like each of the 6 sectors has a kind of equal vote, like when they're tallied up?
Yes, it's a weighted.
1/6.
Yes, sir. 16.7% each sector has for a maximum contribution to a vote. And so, Travis, the votes are you're either in favor, opposed, or you abstain. Basic 3 categories. And depending how members in a sector vote, you'll see the vote totals come out as such. So in the instance here at the participants committee, you can see that the generation sector, transmission sector, and the publicly owned entity sector all supported the ISO filing. And then there was varying support. The supplier sector was like 11.69%, alternative resource sector 7.22% in favor, and end users 2.09% in favor. So you can see how that distribution affects the ultimate vote count. So again, in this case, we had this process, and this is the final tally of how the Order 2222 was supported by NEPOOL members. Again, ISO proposal supported. AE will more than likely, if I'm them, done this myself, it'd move on to FERC when the ISO filed as February 2, 2022, 30-day comment period. And what I would expect that we'll see a lot of ink spill where people will be on both sides saying, hey, we support this or we oppose this. And it's really the opportunity for folks to go to the commission and provide their input as to why they figure either the ISO compliance filing was compliant or not, and what they would want to see changed. And again, by and large, that should be consistent with positions they took in the process. Otherwise, NEPOOL would weigh in and say, those are issues were never raised for us to consider, and just have that kind of commentary in that process. Any comments there? MOPR. So,
Before we, sorry,
yeah.
I just want to make sure that was a helpful overline of sort of the process.
Yeah.
One piece that I think would be useful and is sort of buried in the nuances, really in the fine print here of the percent voting. Can you articulate what it was that within that AR sector, the 7% that voted in favor were not resources that represent sort of demand response providers? They were, maybe existing hydro resources or other sort of larger non-VR providers. Within the end user sector, that very small percentage of the vote represents a lot of load in New England, as well as a lot of consumer advocates, et cetera, for the region. Could you unpack a little bit of what it was that the sort of target audience of 2222 expressed frustration around ISO's proposal? It's curious, and I think maybe if you've got any commentary, I'd love to hear sort of the entire generation sector who doesn't offer DER supports ISO's proposal. The entire transmission sector, is impacted by DER because metering issues supports ISO's proposal. But I think there's sort of the other piece of this process was what was represented by all of the providers who are seeking to actually utilize the 2222 proposal. And so to see essentially zero support from that entire community and de minimis support from many of the people, essentially all of the non-municipal load customers who would be able to immediately enroll and benefit from 2222, their support for ISO's proposal seems striking here. And I was wondering if you could just unpack some of those
Sure.
reasons.
No, fair enough, and certainly add color as you feel appropriate. If I go back X amount of months, I don't necessarily remember everything that took place in debate, but certainly when you look at the stakeholder process, I mean, these are business interests generally, how they align, and you see that pretty much with many of the votes. And so when you look at the generation sector, they're saying, look, the ISO, in their opinion, described a revisions to their governing documents they felt were compliant. What that means is they were also looking at to say they're not looking to perhaps allow expansion of other business models that might weigh into their revenue streams. And as Michael mentioned, there's other providers out there, Enel, Angie, Borrego, other folks that the order 2022 would feed into and allow their opportunities that don't perhaps exist today, or a different way of doing it than it does today. So the generation sector, which doesn't necessarily, not in all cases, NRG does provide these services, doesn't necessarily have all these service capabilities or support them, would not be voting in favor. They would say, look, we feel materially the ISO is compliant and we have our other interests and we support the ISO. Transmission providers, as Michael mentioned, they're concerned about meter reading, sub-metering, coordination to an extent. There's a lot of coordination that is required between distribution utilities, which is the underlying discos of the IOUs, investor-owned utilities. And that's Mass Power, Massachusetts, Granite State, those are the distribution companies. They have a requirement to also involve themselves in coordination, which was included in the ISO documentation, but there is other things, as Michael mentioned, metering, sub-metering, which they didn't support in the amendments that came forward. Public power. Again, we looked at the issue that double counting. We've had issues of double counting in this region. Millions of dollars was taken from the market illegally. People were found out by the Office of Enforcement. Money was disgorged. People were fined millions of dollars for illegal activities. So we look at, these are settled matters. Some of the proposals went at issues that were previously resolved on double counting. For us as well, expansion. We don't involve ourselves traditionally in demand response, primarily because it's what's the trade-off? For demand response, if I give a megawatt of demand response, then the ISO must adjust its long-term load forecast to add that back in, plus the reserve margin. So I'm paying more than I get out of it for capacity charges in the region. So we look at that as well. Let's just shift that balance from providers that are getting paid to us that are paying for it. So public power looks at settled matters where we had issues that were already in front of FERC, and FERC came back and ruled these are settled matters. Also, what's the impact from some of the proposals? Are they reliable? Are they affect reliability? Do we have settlement concerns, and as defined here? In an instance, I referenced the proposal that would have looked at regulation and frequency control. It wasn't, in my opinion, fully developed because there's a specific model that works under, and the proponent really didn't have a detailed, I didn't think they had a real good understanding how it works in New England. And I signaled that interested in the conversation because that looked to be a provision of services that were good and lower cost to consumers, but it wasn't fully vetted and returned to us. So those were some of the views from our side, at least in those other areas you look at. I think certainly end users looked at it as perhaps their view, better consumer impact for those folks that are in those areas getting those services. Other opportunities there for them to participate, perhaps more than what's allowed for today. Because if you look at New England right now, it has demand response for active demand and passive demand. That means passive demand means energy efficiency and so forth. About 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of that in the market right today. Active demand is resources that can be dispatched and participate, shave their capacity peak, and participate in the energy and reserve markets. So they're looking to expand those opportunities. Alternative resource sector, again, as Michael highlighted, if you look at some of the parties that are in there, hydro, solar, storage, some of those parties weren't necessarily going to be positioned to provide these services, so they didn't necessarily support it. They thought the proposal was compliant. Others that were more inclined to support the amendments and not support the ISO. So Michael, I don't know if that covers the issues you were looking to hear on, and if there's anything else you wish to add, please do.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. And I guess kind of taking this back to how does this impact Belmont Light? As you alluded to earlier, Belmont Light would have to opt into this program. I think that's a question and a decision that I hope to look forward to as we transition to the Belmont Light Board to participate in and sort of do evaluation of, is this worth the town's time, effort, and money? But I can't help but sort of pause and ask the question, in looking at ISO's proposal, essentially from the get-go, hearing a very unified voice from essentially every provider of these services that FERC is essentially directing, ordering ISO New England to unlock and allow the ability of them to provide what they're technically able to do. Hearing sort of ISO, your proposal is deficient. ISO, your proposal will not unlock any new barriers. ISO, you're bringing forward something that fundamentally will not change the status quo. Can you adapt? Can you change? And for 6 to 8 months throughout the stakeholder process to hear ISO New England say no. Essentially no. There were some things that were adopted. I think many of them, and the most impactful ones, were well outside of sort of the DER process. Like there's one particular related to how solar resources come in through their interconnection process, which I think is a huge win. That one was also very clearly, FERC literally said in their filing, thou shalt do this, and ISO managed to do that. So I find it interesting that Belmont Light, who has very little sort of on the line here, we're not going to be sort of subject to this. We have to opt in. We have the ability to stand on the sideline, that we would vote to support it as opposed to, and we haven't mentioned that you can also abstain on some of these voting items. And so, you know, recognizing that there's goodwill to support ISO New England and the things that they do, I also wonder, sort of as we Belmont Light, a very sort of forward-looking community with very aggressive goals in how we deploy electrification and how we procure our clean supply, doing the time of use pilot, all of these things to sort of advance how we use and consume reliable electricity for a low cost, that we would essentially ignore the entire developer community seeking to bring these resources to market and say, essentially, by supporting ISO's proposal and opposing their proposals, I mean, there's effectively almost a message there that says, you must not understand your business models right. ISO has this correct, you don't. As opposed to a message maybe from an abstention that would say, this seems complicated. This doesn't seem like this is a finished chapter or a completed story. ISO, you have sort of been very rigid in how you've brought forward your proposal, what you've listened to from the stakeholder community. So I think that's an area where, as we go forward, it would be useful, whether it's with the Light Board, LBAC, or sort of however the relationship exists with E&E, to maybe just have a little bit more robust understanding. Because from my role, putting, you know, with my Belmont Light hat on as a community member in this town, to say, I don't quite understand why we as a community would have supported ISO New England's proposal and opposed the other ones, as opposed to essentially just abstaining from all of them because there wasn't sort of a clear horse in the race here. So, you know, we could spend a lot more time articulating what the specific barriers are, but you know, I think they were very clearly articulated that what ISO's proposed is not going to really do anything for the DER community. And I think anyone who is in that space, you know, we can pick certain examples and try and walk through them, but I don't know if it's worth the committee's time. We're not going to see really any participation through this. So that's really sort of one of the questions and outreach to Craig and conversations that we've had at this community previously was looking at Belmont Light's mission statement, looking at our role, looking at sort of our vision. How is our vote to support ISO New England and oppose and you know, if we don't support AE's proposals, the other stakeholders' proposals, I take no issue with that. And I think you've articulated some good concerns with them. But again, there's also this abstention vote that comes into play to say, you know what, it's confusing. We don't have necessarily a vested interest here. Where does that play into how Belmont Light specifically voted in this process?
Yeah, fair question. And so, you know, looking at the fact that ISO was asked to vote to provide compliance. And so as all these processes do, and to be completely transparent, people also align their business interests sometimes ahead of what's needed for the region. That's a fact. People do that. They're moving their ball forward because they have objectives on their end. Looking at the ISO proposal, we looked at it as a compliant. Does it meet the compliance requirements? You have ISO's insight, ISO's expertise as folks that are running the system and involved in demand response since I was involved with back in 2000 when it first came into the market, and certainly working to make sure that it integrates with their system. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, the amendments that came through didn't get support. Didn't get support by 60–70% of the folks out there, 80% in some cases. So if there's going to be an objective moving forward where Belmont wants more involvement in those discussions, glad to have it. We looked at it from the broad perspective. Did the ISO proposal look compliant? These are the other amendments look to be fully baked or appropriate or valuable to us in terms of what we were going to get out of, and we didn't see that. Now, could you have abstained for Belmont? Could have, for sure. Belmont would have been, the only abstention in the public power sector, but yes.
You're on mute, Craig.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just real quick, Dave. Can you just at a very high level describe what it would look like for Belmont Light if we opted into this program? Any big ticket type of items? I know the
well, a couple things, and one thing that the order is supportive for distribution companies to be involved in that. You're indemnified if something goes wrong on your system and a provider is unable to support its position in the market in real time. You're indemnified. So if a pole gets knocked down and somebody's on that feeder and has a bid in the day-ahead market but can't perform, they get penalized based on the spread between day-ahead and real-time energy prices. But you, Belmont, would be absolved, which is one of the first things I looked at is what's the setup on the regulatory fund, setting that aside. To participate, Belmont would opt in. It would open the door for not just Belmont to participate if it wanted to participate itself. It's now open for any third-party provider that wants to come in and aggregate your customers into a distributed energy resource aggregation to participate in the market. It would require Belmont to participate in both the review of interconnection to make sure these resources are interconnected and can participate in the market. It would require Belmont to coordinate with distributed energy resource providers, both on their day-ahead bid and real-time offers. If a provider is bidding into the day-ahead market, it would look to check with you to say, hey, we're going to participate. I have these customers in your footprint. Is there anything you can tell me about the line they're connected to being out of service during the next operating day so that I know that the bid I'm going to submit can be supported in my bid and in real time? So that coordination. Then in the day, if something goes wrong, there will be coordination between the distributed energy resource aggregator and somebody at Belmont. Is this resource still available, or did I lose this resource such that I can adjust my bids in the retail and the wholesale market in real time can be adjusted up to 90 minutes ahead. So if a provider's got a bid in the market and it loses a part of its portfolio, it can go in and lower its bid in the market. Still subject to difference between what it cleared day ahead financially and what it delivers in real time. But really, it's a matter of making sure they look at the interconnection, support the interconnection, look at the requirements to participate, indicate that the resource should be able to participate, and then the coordination between real time and day ahead markets. That's really the envelope for the distribution utility. It opens its door. It's open for all providers to come in and provide those services. Michael, I don't know if you see anything else that needs to be added in there.
No, I think that's a pretty good description. The only maybe other point of consideration I would say is, I have heat pumps. I've got an electric hot water heater. I have an EV, probably hopefully soon. Looking at Becca and Craig, we have a residential battery program, and there's incentives to install batteries. How do I sort of find the most economic, cost-effective way? How does Belmont find the way to say, let's aggregate a bunch of electric vehicles across the town? And maybe just in the interest of time, can we articulate that from the perspective of what would be different if we open it up to sort of the market to allow sort of market competition of providers coming in and offering these services at a competitive rate versus remain sort of an exclusive territory that doesn't allow that competition to come into our service territory? Is there a significant difference in the workload and the cost to Belmont and then sort of the total value to consumers? Because it's a lot of work one way or the other. And I think maybe just the difference there would be sort of, are we leaving something on the table by not necessarily participating? And also looking at the clock, we certainly don't have to go into some of
Yeah,
these
exactly. I'm looking at the clock.
questions.
Michael, who were you asking of Dave or of Craig?
I think at this point, maybe it's a rhetorical question, just given the distance from when, I mean, first, Order 2222 would need to be accepted by FERC. Second, it would be implemented by ISO. And third, that's what, 2026 timeline before we get there. So we've got at least a couple more meetings before we have to make those decisions.
Yeah, but to your base point, it does come down to the distribution utility looking at all the factors to support participation and the benefit of doing so. And that's really the essence of Mike's question is, what's the value prop based on the cost? And that's always what you do when you're considering change. And so it would be what infrastructure do I need to implement the program and manage the program and participate? And what does the municipal light plant and its customers get as benefits related to that?
Great. I'm gonna please raise your hand if you've got more questions from the committee. But I think we can probably go on to the MOPR. Dave.
Okay. MOPR. So presume perhaps not everybody's familiar with MOPR's minimum offer pricing rule. So the minimum offer pricing rule is a structure in the capacity markets, and not only New England, it's PJM, it's in New York. It really is. It was designed as a mitigation tool to look at and ensure new entry into the market is competitive. Once a first resource clears, it can be considered new and should be competitive because markets are based on sending signals to ensure investment. So it's buyer side mitigation to prevent what's called monopsony power from being exercised in the forward capacity market, in New England in this case. And really, it was designed to prevent load interest from going out and buying and building new resources and bringing them in at the market at as low as the price as possible, perhaps uncompetitively, to tank the overall market. So if you figure the market in New England for capacity is $1 billion, if load could go out and say, look, public power, we're 1,300 megawatts just for Energy New England customers. If you take all public power at 25 or 3,000 megawatts and go out and buy capacity or build capacity to support that and bring it in at zero on a $30,000 mark, 30,000 megawatt market, 10% of the market, you could come in new and tank the market below competitive prices, which ends up driving market exit, reliability concerns. So monopsony power was a concern when they developed the MOPR. And what do we really mean by a MOPR? So if you look at the current market for capacity, you have demand curves, and you have to build a demand curve, you have to have a reference technology to help shape what the market should look like. In New England, that's a General Electric GE7H02 gas turbine, just a gas turbine, 360 megawatts. It's been determined based on looking at what it costs to build it, put it into the market. If you remove the energy and reserves component that they get paid, they would need $7.47 to break even to be able to build it, make return on their investment to continue to have folks build these things. So if a market participant came in and says, I can do it for $2, they would have to go to the internal market monitor, provide a cost workbook and say, I can do it for $2. The internal market monitor would look that over and say, your pricing's wrong, your cost structures are wrong, your expectations of markets are wrong, and we really think you're a $6 unit. So that's how the MOPR works. It says, look, we have an expectation on cost based on technology type, what you need to be able to recover all your costs in the marketplace, and it makes sure that folks enter the market competitively. So in this case, it's a $7.47 base unit. You can come in and offer data that shows it's less than that, have done this many times with offer floors in front of the market monitor. And you can come in at a lower price, but you have to justify it's cost justification. That presumably says that the market stays competitive because you've got cost oversight in the marketplace. Well, what does that mean? Well, the MOPR, the minimum offer pricing rule, has created problems. It has prevented state-sponsored resources from clearing in the forward capacity auctions based on their entry price for new resources. So like earlier emerging technologies such as solar and terrestrial wind and now offshore wind didn't clear FCAs because their entry cost was many times higher than the starting price of the auction. They couldn't even enter the auction. And so they came in uneconomic. People would come in and try to justify those costs. Some came in lower and did enter the market. It also applies to other technologies. Storage was suffering from the same issue when it first entered the market. But what we've seen is solar, terrestrial wind, and storage prices tumbling downward as they become more, as they enter the market more often and have other options available to them. But with the problem with MOPR setup was consumers are paying twice. So when you look at the IOUs, investor-owned utilities, under Massachusetts 883, the law that requires offshore wind purchases, you know, Massachusetts contracting about, you know, at least 3,200 megawatts of offshore wind. Offshore wind, because it's a high capital cost to build those, were uneconomic in the forward capacity market. If the forward capacity market had a starting price of 13, offshore wind was way above that in terms of its needs from that market. It couldn't enter the market. So what would happen? The customers of investor-owned utilities would be under contract to buy these offshore wind development projects. They'd pay for that. And then the ISO would have to actually go out and clear additional capacity in the market because those offshore wind resources weren't included in that market design. They could supply energy, but not capacity. So consumers are paying twice. So longstanding issue, the region has tried to design different ways around it. We had a renewable technology resource exemption for a number of years. It allowed so many megawatts of capacity in without mitigation to allow state-sponsored resources in. That went away when they developed what's called the capacity auction with sponsored policy resource, CASPR, and which allows, it's basically a cash for clunker design, which we'll talk about in a moment here. But bottom line is the MOPR was really designed early on to make sure that market pricing could sustain itself and assure that there's competitive entry and exit, and that investor dollars would flow into the region and assure reliability under resource adequacy models. Lo and behold, time goes by, and the FERC, current FERC Chairman Glick says, MOPRs are no good. We want them out of the markets. What it really means is he wants them modified. He wants them out, but he's accepted modifications in the PJM case, and ISO is going to look to submit a modified proposal, or effectively transition followed by a modified proposal. But the bottom line is FERC is indicating change your tariff, modify these MOPRs, or GLIC, FERC, will submit what's called a 206 under Federal Power Act. It'll say your tariff is unjust and unreasonable, and you must now comply and change your tariff as we direct. So that's the setup for the MOPR modification discussion. Questions before I move on?
No, but can you wrap it up in maybe, I don't know, under 10 minutes?
I can mash the pedal and get us done in under 10 minutes.
Thanks.
Okay, so ISO recognized market design for CASPR wasn't working. ISO senior management instructed their staff to start a MOPR modification last May, and two proposals came to the NEPOOL Participants Markets Committee, then the Participants Committee. And first is the ISO proposal was to modify the MOPR 5 megawatts or less units. No look, you just got enter the market without mitigation. State-sponsored resources, if you met the state-sponsored definition, which I also negotiated to make sure it applied to municipal systems under Senate Bill 9, which was passed this last year. No look, you can come into the market unmitigated. If you don't fall into any of those two buckets, you have to provide price justification to enter the market. You're merchant. The ISO design also, because there's now risk in the market, so the number of years the market is there at 0, looking over a 20-year project life, they have to adjust the market for risk. The ISO's consultant said that needs to raise the curves by $1.19 kW a month. And what does that mean? If we cleared the FCA 16 today, which we did, and then we implemented the ISO design, the demand curves would rise up and the same megawatts would get paid more next clearing because the demand curves have risen up to respect the risk in the marketplace. Also, the pay for performance penalty rate that capacity resources would face for non-performance rises up to 10,846 megawatt hour. If under scarcity conditions, I'm not providing my obligations, I'm penalized $10,846 a megawatt for non-delivery. That's the ISO proposal that was targeted to go in. FCA 17 didn't happen. We'll talk about that. A participant, a generator proposal came up, says, look, 2-year transition, FCA 17 and 18. What they leveraged was the old renewable technology resource exemption framework. They said, if we do this, it's for 2 years. It'll allow the market to transition. We've implemented transitions a number of times in the market for big market changes. There are no whack at or no adjustment for risk for those 2 years because the market design is relatively the same as it is today, but they've allowed 700 megawatts of a resource to enter. PFP, the penalty rate stays at the current 9,337 megawatts an hour. Nuance, they eliminate this cash for test price, which should facilitate more of the cash for clunker changes. In other words, old unit wanting to retire, a renewable resource wanting to come in, willing to pay the old resource to leave, and a new one come in and be considered existing going forward. The same sponsored policy definition resource applies under the ISO proposal, applies here, meaning municipal light plants can bring their renewable projects through without mitigation. Never occurred before. It's the first time it's happening in both proposals. And then we can revert to the ISO design, one on the left-hand side, in 2019, sorry, FCA 19, which is applicable for the year starting June 2028. Side-by-side comparison, the ISO proposal, no mitigation for less than 5 megawatt resources, no mitigation for sponsored policy resources, including projects from MLPs, accelerated resource mix change. So theoretically, more decarbonization would take place. Cons, some injection of winter reliability risk, as larger stored resources might see a price drop and a perception of a price drop and higher penalty rates and exit the market sooner than they otherwise would have under a transition. Incomplete design, there's changes in how qualification is supposed to take place. There's a recognition that, by way of example, as solar increases its penetration into the market, the peak shifts later into the day. Solar is less valuable later in the day in terms of resource adequacy, but they're still getting treated at the same value they are today. They and other resources, including generators, would need to be reviewed to make sure they're getting the appropriate accreditation in the capacity market. Those accreditations would trend downward under future design change. Both will be subject to that. The ISO proposal, of course, generators and suppliers, certain suppliers, those with generation, would be fighting it at FERC. Switch to the Vistra proposal. Pros, possible price support for large storage resources to hang around for 2 more years. Lower D-list price in the market because it's not facing the higher pay for performance penalty rate. The higher the penalty rate, the more likely I'm going to represent an exit bid to reflect that risk. The possibility that could trigger on the margin means higher capacity prices if it triggers. We get the same MLP definition, and we allow up to 700 megawatts of state-sponsored resources to enter the market in those 2-year period unmitigated. The cons for us was the loss of the 5 megawatt or less mitigation threshold, potentially higher prices during that time frame. The risk was low, and litigation. NGOs, alternative resource sector folks, end users would litigate because they would prefer the ISO proposal.
I say Dave has a hand. Sorry,
Dave, just a background question quick.
Yes.
Your last slide said that our MLP projects, I guess if we contract with solar, that meets the definition of state sponsored. Well, I'm trying to understand. I don't think there's no state incentive involved, right? Because we don't get smart like in Massachusetts. There's no solar incentive. We're just buying direct. So I wonder why it qualifies as state sponsored.
So the state sponsored definition really required that if you were building a renewable project, you needed to have a regulated rate or charge that was backing the project, and it met the renewable definition. So MLPs, if they were involved in either contracting wise or building such projects, could not qualify in the capacity market as a state sponsored resource. Why? We weren't subject to a requirement under state law to decarbonize our portfolio, and they didn't view the rates set by MLPs as regulated rates. I negotiated with the Assistant General Counsel of the ISO, said, wait a minute, actually under Senate Bill 9 passed in March of 2021, which is the GGGS, greenhouse gas emissions standard from MLPs that's now in effect, we are statutorily required to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Furthermore, under General Law 164, Section 12, we set our own rates. We are the regulatory authority. We have rate setting capability. We put those two together, we meet the definition. So now we can bring our resources through either the ones we contract through or develop on our own to, in fact, get into the projects without being mitigated.
It's interesting. Even if we get a great deal and our power is really cheap, it's still called state sponsored. You know, because it's not a market incentive. I've seen some of these projects coming across. I don't think there's any incentive involved.
State sponsored means it's being supported by your ratepayers. When you build a project, your ratepayers are paying for that project.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
It's a nuance. State sponsored really was looking at, it was sponsored through state contracts for offshore wind is really what the target was.
Okay.
But when you start expanding this definition, we prefer, frankly, whatever we build as renewable, just let's bring it in. We shouldn't be mitigated, period. In fact, MLPs for years have been fighting in this process to eliminate the MOPR. That was our position right along. I haven't made presentations myself on it.
Make sure I understand. So if we did a contract with natural gas, that's state sponsored because we're right there.
Yeah, but it's not renewable. It doesn't meet the other part of the definition.
It has to be renewable. So okay, it seems weird, this definition.
Yeah, no.
It's worth noting though, I mean, consider the number of projects that Belmont Light has sort of entertained that don't come with RECs. And I won't go into details to disclose information, but just as you think through what are the projects that we're interested in that don't come with a sort of REC component,
REC isn't state sponsored. I mean, we negotiate what we pay for that, right?
The REC is a state market base. I mean, you negotiate a contract rate for REC offtake, but you are off-taking a state-sponsored policy certificate. It's sort of
right.
If there was no renewable portfolio standard, that REC would be valueless.
Right, but we're doing it on a voluntary basis, right? For the most part, I can understand if we had a compliance component, but we're doing it voluntarily. But anyways, it's getting in the weeds. But thank you, Dave. I just kind of couldn't figure that out.
The key there, though, is the value created by state policy is the REC. You can buy it voluntarily, or you can buy it for compliance reasons. But the reason why you have to buy it to begin with is because the state has created a market demand for the certificate, and it's state policy that has created that value. Every PPA for solar would be a lot cheaper if you didn't buy any RECs. And so because the state has said, look, we're going to create a scarcity condition of these instruments, then that thing has value. We go out and voluntarily buy it because we want to get as green of a supply as we can. But it's the state policy supporting the REC market that drives the value creation there. And so those projects would be deemed state policy resources.
And just to wrap up that point, Dave, there is actually couple things. E&E was involved in negotiating the greenhouse gas standard that exists today that we are now subject to. So you do have the requirement to decarbonize your portfolio by 2050. Part of that is take our contracts previously, we get a solar or wind project, we get RECs with it. We would sell those RECs, which would depreciate our total project cost. Great deal for us. In the future, you'll be actually converting those RECs and retiring them against your load. Also, there was, I believe, Ben Rigucci and others negotiated a MLP solar program, right? Like a SMART program. We've been doing that for a little while out there. Can't remember the stats of it. It's not I'm not plugged in on that one, but it's something if you all are interested, I can follow up with Ben. Bottom line is state-sponsored definition in this presentation is kind of wide. I'm just trying to highlight it's related to state initiatives and that we are now plugged into that because we have a statutory requirement, and it lists under Section 25F of the state laws, it lists the types of projects that are in there. But Michael kind of has said, if it gets a REC, it's kind of a state resource, you know what I mean? So that's kind of the bucket we're in.
And I'm now going over, but I I trying to figure out how this conversation, the last couple minutes on this question, actually affect Belmont Light. As like, and what this body cares about. So, I mean, because our contract, when we contract for 5% of a wind farm or something like that, is that even relevant to this conversation, or is it only relevant when we install solar on our municipal lands here?
So if you're contracting as part of a group of folks contracting for a wind project, a new wind project, right? Or a new solar project, it would play into how the resource is treated in participation in the forward capacity market.
So that developer
Previously-
would get access to the forward capacity market when they might otherwise not have access to the market.
That's correct.
Okay,
It might be
that's
priced
enough for
out
me right
that-
now.
There it is.
I mean,
Now that
yeah.
you're under state law, hey, we are statutorily required. Don't mitigate this project. Let it come in.
Okay, thanks.
So those are the pros and cons of the two proposals. This one here that came to the January Markets Committee, the two proposals came through. ISO had signaled, marginally that it wasn't opposed to the, the transition period. They had developed their own. And their proposal really is to make sure that state-sponsored, ISO's proposal, state-sponsored resources come in unmitigated and ensures that the adjustments to the MOPR treat risk in the market and ensure investment keeps coming in by raising the curves up a bit, making them a little more richer. The participant proposal was a 2-year transition for FCA 17 and 18, effectively for June of 2026 and June of 2027, those 2 years that it encompasses. The Markets Committee voted to oppose the transition proposal. It got like 24% in favor, and supported the ISO's proposal with 74%. Prior to the Markets Committee vote, I'm lost my focus here, but prior to the Markets Committee vote, ISO senior management started calling folks, CEO called me and other folks to start saying, look, we have concerns about going straight to our proposal because of reliability reasons, didn't provide any quantitative data. It's their view as a system operator that they have concerns. Told them, frankly, they didn't do a great job expressing that at that time, but they reached out to myself and others saying, hey, we got concerns. And I abstained on behalf of all EE clients in the Markets Committee vote, signaling that need to hear more information. Voted for the ISO proposal, abstained on the 2-year transition. The 5 out of the 6 states indicated at the Markets Committee and subsequently they weren't opposed to the transition, but like municipal light plants and MLPs, we prefer no MOPR, but we want to hear what the ISO has said. We can support a 2-year, we could not be opposed to a 2-year transition. 5 out of 6 states, with New Hampshire being the only one that wants a MOPR. Don't know why. They want a MOPR. I can't figure that one out. The other 5 states say they're not opposed to it. That means they're signaling they're not going to fight it. Like us, they want it to go away, but they understand there's some risk out there. Let's see. The Markets Committee vote as it is right here, 74% in favor of the ISO proposal, 24% in favor of the VISTA proposal. We abstained in that vote. Let's move to the real action, which is the Participants Committee. We moved to February, the NEPOOL Participants Committee, the last stop on the stakeholder process before FERC filing. ISO ramped up its concern about reliability all the way up to their board level. Their senior staff is now dialing people and talking to them about their concerns. Again, there was not any quantitative data provided. They're responsible for resource adequacy. They see concerns on their end. If you look at the two proposals, they're about pricing around the same spot. Resource mix changes a bit under the ISO proposal versus the VISTA proposal. You could argue a couple different ways how this would turns out. But the ISO significantly ramped up its efforts going into the Participants Committee vote of February. Going into that vote, all of public power was in favor of the transition. The morning of, MWEC flopped its vote from in favor to opposed. NHEC, VEPSA, and CMEC abstained. NHEC, because New Hampshire is opposed to the MOPR, wants the MOPR. CMEC, not under state requirements to do anything on decarbonization. They didn't get anything out of it. And BEPSA, although they have some requirements, they just abstained. The bottom line is the ISO flipped and MWEC flipped. ISO pushed hard for its support of the transition period. Not a great process, in my opinion. I expressed that with ISO senior management and direct phone calls that if in fact you were more in favor of the transition, we should have heard about that sooner versus a late push to get us, us that are looking at reliability, to say that you were in favor of it. Bottom line is the vote flipped. It went to be 69% in favor of the transition, and across sectors, I have the vote counts here at the bottom. This one was not a good process in terms of how it resulted in the end. But the vote is support of the transition period, and Belmont opposed. All the other E&E customers supported a transition based on what we see as reliability concerns. MWEC opposed, again, flopping the morning of. They were hoping to force what's called a jump ball in the process. The rest of public power abstained.
Dave,
So,
I think we need to wrap it up. Just
yeah, sorry, yeah.
But oh, that's good. We've got a lot on our agenda still. So I think we asked a lot of questions along the way. Is there anything else that people are on top of mind?
This will be filed with FERC at the end of the month. I expect we'll see a lot of ink on this one as well, as the process wasn't that clean. And there's a lot of debate around how did ISO get from one position to another, and what is the reliability risks they were concerned about, and perhaps we'll see that detailed better in the FERC arguments.
Great. Well, this has been a lot of good information and a lot of behind the scenes on a market and area that we don't always see at this board. So I appreciate it. Thank you for attending. Craig, is there anything else that you want to make sure we hit before we move on?
No, I
Lots of
think
stuff.
that,
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say the same thing, Dave. First of all, yes, thank you on my behalf as well. And obviously, I know Mike knows this intimately, and of course, Dave, but you can see it's pretty complex. There's a lot that goes into these. Sometimes they last years as it goes through the process. So yeah, I just thank Dave for joining us this morning.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, folks. Pleasure to meet you all virtually.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, we can move to financials. And I know we have some people leaving. Let's just make sure I think hopefully we can, I don't know, move quickly through the rest of this. So
I'll do my best.
thank you.
Aiden, can you please make me a co-host so I can share?
Yeah,
my
I'll
screen? Okay, yeah.
Can I ask a preliminary question about this?
Of course.
So normally I would assume a budget would be done before the budget year in question.
Yeah.
Is there some reason why we've got a draft budget in February for a fiscal year 2022 budget?
So we were in our normal budget process, Steve, and what happened was we presented the 5-year study that MWIC put on in December, and the plan was to present our budget the first meeting of January. As we turned from late November to early January, the cost of natural gas started to accelerate in price, and we took a step back and we re-looked at our what we were estimating, what was happening. And so we took a little bit of extra time just trying to identify the cost of electricity on the spot market and how it was going to influence our budget for the coming year.
Okay, that makes sense. What I'm just trying to remember, wouldn't you normally do a budget in the fall for the coming fiscal year? I mean,
So
Yeah,
go on.
we start our budget process in October into November. And as I said, with the holidays and with, we were a little delayed with the MWIC presentation. So we wanted to present that. And so we chose that in December, and then made that decision in January to flip-flop essentially our budget presentation with the year-end presentation. So the original plan was to present the budget, like I said, in early that first meeting of January, and the year-end summary from the 2021 in February. And we just kind of flip-flop those for the sake of getting better information into the budget with the market.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll start. Good morning, everyone. I purposely prepared like a very high level memo, which Eden shared with everyone yesterday. I'll keep it on the screen because I think it would be probably easier to navigate through this memo, and then if you have any specific questions, go through that like almost 60-page document I prepared. But typically what I do, and as Craig said, I started this process early October. I started analyzing our expenses, our commitments, purchase power costs and everything, and combine it into one like big model, trying to project what we have. It's always a work with the stakeholders, stakeholders, analyzing, as I said, commitments, agreements, what we plan to do, looking into our like capital and operating budgets, and things like that. So what happened, and Craig has already mentioned it, I started looking into like overall budget in December and into actual purchase power costs, and noticing that everything is going up significantly. We agreed to like evaluate and hold on a little bit and see where we're going to be with the purchase power costs. And it's mentioned in this memorandum too that original projections, which I received in early November, and projections in the end of January, the difference was like approximately 5%. So the January projections were 5% higher, and it's 700,000, a little bit over than that, which is a very material amount for us. So going back to all of that, so what I did, like as I said, I just combine all our operating expenses, all our projected payroll and like overall like maintenance costs, as well as capital costs, and I came up to the obviously P&L. This is a summary which you can see. It's a summary of income statement, which is Schedule 1 in the total budget package. So you can see that our like 2022 budget stays more or less flat. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that total revenues for 2022 budget also includes a little bit over 700,000 of PCA collections. Just to refresh your memory, we we implemented PCA charge effective February to collect uncollected amount for 2021, estimated uncollected amount. So this 26,000 of 22 budget includes that 700,000 of PCA. And you can see that we are pretty much flat from like 2021 budget comparing to 2021 budget and 2021 estimated actuals. I also wanted to mention that because we have our like field visit and audit in the end of February. I call this unaudited actual. There'll be some minor changes which relate to auditors adjustments, and it's typical, but pretty much that's what I expect to see in the final financials. And this is like this column, which is called 2021 unaudited actual. For expenses, and that's very like this is very representative. So you can see like purchase power, 15.9 million budgeted for 2022, comparing to 13.8 million budget for 2021 and actuals, which were already like $1 million higher comparing to the budget for 2021, mainly due to increase of spot market purchases. And I will be producing like a separate analysis when we have audited financials with a deep dive into the reasons why there were difference between 2021 actuals and budget. So, and it gives us, like, if we're comparing budget to budget for purchase power, it's 15% increase, which I said is material for us as, you know, as organization, because it's a lot. We're pretty flat on operations. There are some shifts up and down, and that's pretty explainable. The inflation rates are high. We can see from like all the new agreements that rates are going up, and that's what drives O&M budget a little bit up comparing to 2021 and 2021 actuals. With all this, our operating income is a little bit lower than $1 million. To me, it's a trigger that we really need rate increase. And we've mentioned that a number of times, that obvious right now, that our rates are not recovering our purchase power costs, especially with the expected increase for 2022. We mentioned that already. Our financial review done by NWEC also was showing similar numbers for 2022, but when they had the data they were analyzing, it wasn't that high comparing to what I use right now for my analysis. So with all these numbers, unfortunately, what we come to is a negative rate of return, which sounds a little funny, but it is what it is. And that's another trigger to, you know, to say that we're not recovering our purchase, like our costs to be able to produce proper rate of return. I have a brief overview here, and I mentioned some of the things which relate to like PCA collections from revenue, just to say that we are flat on revenues. For power, we have an extensive analysis which Becca did, and it's a part of a whole document. It's Schedule 3 of these like almost 60-page document. If needed, we can dive into it as well. There are some things which are influencing overall projections for 2022, but they're very expected, and that's how we see the situation would look like. So as a brief overview, that's it. But I would be, you know, happy to go through any details. And I see that Michael has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Travis. This makes sense, and thank you for preparing it, Maria. And everything you're saying is the same thing I'm seeing across all the other sort of energy forecast trends, futures. As we think about on the last page, I think it was the negative 1.15 rate of return here. And I don't know if this is a question for you or for Craig. How are we thinking through, like, we have some amount of our forward energy hedged. We've bought that previously, potentially at lower rates than current market prices. I know energy futures are up higher than they have been for the last several years regardless, so that any future power buying we do now will be more expensive than what it has been. Are we in a position where we can float some amount of deficit for 1 to 2 years without necessarily adjusting rates? And, you know, sort of, could you speak to our ability to kind of ride through some of these on longer wave cycles, so to speak? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll jump and try it. So we did do that this past year, actually, 2021. So going back to 2018 with the cost of service study, they recommended an increase of 1.5% over 5 years. So each year for 5 years through 2022, 23 actually. And what took place was there was a 2% adjustment in early 2019 with an agreement to revisit it in 2021. And so 2021, we did exactly what you said. We kind of, you know, coming off the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic to the general, you know, citizenry of Belmont, we decided to not make any adjustment, to float through that year. And that's why we underwent the financial review with MWIC. And so when they came back with their review, they concurred with the cost of service study that we should be looking at raising rates to collect because we were going to start to under collect. They thought at the time that we would have this year to really have robust discussion on how to do that, what the best way was. And then what happened was the cost of energy, the cost of natural gas in particular, exploded, and it's really just fast-tracked us into the situation where instead of spending the year maybe looking at this a little deeper, we're going to very quickly run into the same situation we had at the end of last year, which was an under collection in our cost. And so kind of back to Steve's earlier point about why we're presenting this later than we would have liked to, was because we, with the last year's overall, how we did overall, we wanted to get out that PCA adjustment and make sure that we had as much runway, if you will, to begin to collect the PCA for the under collection of last year and not have it be a bigger number than it needed to be. And so that was the decision we made to kind of flip-flop these, why this is a little bit later. But we're seeing the same thing this year with power supply. That hasn't gone down yet. Reading through and revisiting the MWIC 5-year memo there, they don't suspect that that's going to change anytime soon. There is a next year, 2023, there is a dip in power supply costs due to the capacity market, which gives us a little bit of breathing room, but it comes right back the following year, 2024 and 25. So we believe at this point that we're really at the end of that time frame where we can kind of wait this out or ride this out any longer. And because of that, we did engage with a vendor to begin a cost of service study anew for us. We're doing it 1 year earlier than the 3 to 5 recommended years to wait. We're in year 4. We decided that this is the time to really jump on it now and take a look and try to use as much runway as we can this year into making any adjustment.
Thanks, Craig. That makes sense.
Steve?
Craig, following up
Oh,
on.
sorry. Steve had his hand up, but Bob, you'll be
No,
next.
Bob has a follow-up.
Okay.
Why don't you go on? Go ahead.
Yeah, Michael asked about the hedging. What's our hedging percentage over the next few years?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't address that, Mike. So this coming year, I think we're at like 79%. Actually, Becker might have the exact numbers more readily available. Well, we're there. If you recall, late last year, we made what seemed like a small adjustment at less than 4%. And we did that purposely to get our hedging up as close as we can to the 80% that we strive to do in our power supply program. So
we're there for 2022.
Right, and then we fall off following years, right, because of contracts expiring, things of that nature. But yeah, Becca, why don't you jump in?
2023, we're at 67%. 2024, we're at 54%, and then it drops up pretty steeply. We're at 28% for 2025. So we have some hedging to achieve in the next couple of years.
Yeah, but budgeted average, I purposely put it on the screen right now. You should see for 2022, we're close to 80%.
Great, thanks. Steve?
Yeah, so I see that our sales forecast is down by about by 1.71% for 2022. Is that because we assumed 2020-21 was an outlier?
Yes, pretty much, Steve. We wanted to take a more conservative view on it. So we based it off with the sales. That is a 5-year average. And we
Okay,
weighted 2021 a little less heavily, just because we
Okay.
didn't want to overstate the revenue.
sure. Have we done any sensitivity analysis to see what our income would be, what our financials would be if sales were the same as 2021?
No, we didn't.
Okay,
I did a quick analysis what it would look like if rates would go up based on the like kilowatt hour rates for all revenue classes would go up like 1.5% and 3%, just to get an understanding what it would bring us from additional revenue perspective. But I didn't look into different sales allocation. It would
Okay.
give us a little bit more, but not significantly. I can run it quickly, probably.
Okay, I'm just curious as to whether that would make a difference or not. And then I see that the income before contributions and transfers is $607,000.
Mhm.
And the contributions and transfers, is that essentially the so-called pilot payment, or are there
It's
other contributions?
Pilot and principal.
Okay,
Go on, yeah.
okay, so that gets us down to the minus 1.15.
Mhm.
The other thing, just I think doing cost of service study is a great idea. I thought the last time we did it, we didn't accomplish as much as we could and should have with the cost of service study. So I'm hoping that this time the design and the results will give us a better idea of who should be, if there are increases, if they should be equally allocated or if they should be allocated in a different fashion, and if the rate design for some of these classes should be changed.
Yeah, we're excited to get those answers as well. I can give you a time frame of when we believe we'll have the output from the study. It's going to be right around the April timeframe. So it'll probably one of the first main pieces of business that the new board will take up.
Okay.
Getting the presentation on what the findings are, and then working with Belmont Light to design the rates appropriately.
Okay, so maybe, I mean, I don't know if I'll be around in April or not, but perhaps I should talk to Becca or you, Craig, or someone else just before that, just to give a little more flesh to what I'm thinking that the cost of service study should help to accomplish, other than just to decide on an overall rate increase.
Sure. Yeah, no. happy
Craig,
to-
my impression is that you already had an RFP out, or like some sort of, you're asking. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, normally it's helpful to have the, hey, this is what we're looking for in the, as you're going shopping around for bids. So should Steve, do you need Steve's input sooner?
Well,
Oh.
yeah, I hadn't understood that the fact that we were initiating cost of service study was the first time I realized that was when in Maria's memo from yesterday.
Sure. So it's right now it's about a 12-week process. And we heard that from multiple vendors. That was the time frame they were giving us. The first half of that is the actual cost of service. That's pretty much a numbers game, looking at what our services cost. The second half of that is more the rate design, the financial piece of it. So we have plenty of time to add comment or work with our vendor to modify or provide any input that we want on that. I can tell you that the vendor, it's the vendor that we hired, and all the vendors that we spoke with, they take a wide range at looking at cost. And they're actually, as you can imagine, in the world of utility, rates are pretty ho-hum as far as designing them. They're pretty basic. So with new rates and different rates, they get pretty excited looking at different ways that they think the market could work. You know, things such as our time of use discussion, right? Those are the things that somewhat seem to excite some of these vendors. So I think there's a lot of eyes looking at what can we do differently or better, or how to you know, slice and dice the data up so that every group is paying their fair share of you know, of the cost.
Okay, I'll be in touch. Thanks very much.
See, I've got a question, but I'll go to Michael first.
Very quickly, and Craig, I think you answered the question. I just was double checking that the time of use, like that concept would be included in how we're looking at the cost of service studies. As we don't know if it's a long-term program or not, but it would be a shame if we did the entire process agnostic or ignoring those. So I think you answered it, that yes, that's part of it. And
Yeah, we won't make any changes to that program because that is the pilot. That's how we
Right.
designed it. We want to run it through. But yeah, it'll be part of the overall discussion. And that'll the presentation to the board, and if the committee still exists as part of that, we'll certainly provide that to the committee as well. But there'll be, I think, a lot of opportunity for stakeholder input and to you know, add any changes we see fit.
Craig or Maria, I was looking over the numbers and just trying to understand. First off, I think this is feedback we gave you a year or two ago about long-term averages, and I really do appreciate in your tables a 3-year average and the 5-year average. So that really helps me provide context. So thank you. And I'm looking at costs, and I noticed that the operations are like the cost between the 2021 and the 2022 budget is about $3 million. I'm looking at page 6 of the bigger document. And 2 million of that seems to be approximately in the purchase power, but what's the other 1 million is kind of spread across operations and maybe a little bit of depreciation. Can you speak to operation trends and why those are higher?
Sure. So we like operations, it's a combination, as I said, of like expected payroll and expected other like operation and maintenance costs. So our property insurance grows, our benefits payments are growing, our depreciation grows because the cost of plant is growing until we retire old substations, because how the depreciation expense is determined at a certain percentage of the total gross plan. So that's like, if to talk about it like on a high level. And there are some other, like, for example, for operations, and I think I mentioned it in my review of year-end, estimated year-end results, tree trimming contract, they doubled their costs. And it's very, very much, you know, like material for us, because either you pay like, I don't know, like 100 a year, or you pay 200,000 a year. I'm like, it's not the exact number, but I'm just giving an example, and some other things as well, including overall inflation rate, which is high, and I see it from the like new extended agreements. The same is related to the cost of materials. We went through our regular material bid and we didn't get normal prices back, and we're talking to the vendors trying to negotiate, and the problem is the whole industry, because of the lack of manufacturing, cost of, I don't know, like copper and some other, you know, materials they're using to produce items we're using for our inventory. It grows, and eventually it influences you know, the overall maintenance cost. Nevertheless, we try to be more how to say, we're watching whether the job is maintenance or capital. We are very targeted to capitalize as much as we can if it's really capital work, but it's still, that's the result.
Thank
Yeah,
you. That's good enough for me. Sorry. Are there any other questions on the budgets?
Yes.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
As I understand it, the money available or after the payment of the pilot is negative. So Craig, do you have a concern here that we're below sea level? Maybe some mitigation through the stabilization reserve, which we added 800,000 to in 2020, would at least put us back to something where we're breaking even after the pilot?
Yeah, I think if this was just a one-time issue with the rising gas prices, natural gas prices, I'd be more apt to think to just make that transfer. But this appears, as far as all the data in our, again, going back to the original cost of service study in 2018, the MWIC financial review just last fall, this looks to be that we're going to come up short as the years go on. So we need to make a substantial change to solidify our revenue versus our expenses. And then we can continue or look at the rate stabilization fund as a means to either top off or to make up any kind of differences. Right now, the rate, we're not where we should be or where the recommendation is for us to be with a rate stabilization fund. We should be trying to achieve a 3-month power supply cost in that fund, and we're just over 2 months. So we're still trying to add to it a little bit here. And in this case, we would be taking from it a pretty substantial amount, it appears. So it's there as an avenue, but I don't believe it's the preferred avenue to take from it at this moment, because this is more of a sustained revenue shortfall going forward. So we want to, correct that and make that a right adjustment there.
Greg, looking at the detail here, the customer accounts for 2021, the uncollectible expenses or uncollectible revenues, I guess you'd say, was a negative in 2021. And then of course it turns back to being a positive. That's back on, I don't have the page number, but it's back in the budget detail. And the customer accounts percentage for 2022, let alone 2021, as a percent of revenue is a high for periods that I've measured for 17 years. The G&A is also high. Can you comment on those?
The
Do you want me to talk about uncollectibles?
Sure.
Because I can talk about it. So for uncollectibles, MOP, we have had over 90 days balance in the end of 2020, around 700,000. And it was reduced to 350, and it came to the level of, I would say, 15, 16, like 2015, 2016, 2018, something like that. So we reduced this amount. Our internal policy says that we have to keep an allowance, which is 75% of the total overdue accounts. Because we reduced during the year, as a year-end adjustment, I just reduced the expense, reducing the allowance. That's what it is. And that's why you see that number there, which is negative.
Okay. But as a percent of revenue, the 2022 budget is at a high for the historical period.
It is, because we still are working on writing off all the accounts which are overdue and have a huge balance, like, I don't know, 15, 20,000, and which are definitely uncollectible. And that's something customer service is working on. Becca may probably chime in if needed and provide more details, but that's a budget I want to keep. In case if we would have to do like significant write-offs during 2022.
So we have been, to Maria's point, we do have a small group of customers that we've had a historical issue with uncollectibles. If we were to write that off as a way of clearing that or go to collections with it, there'd be certainly a big hit against the budget. But we've actively since late last summer, really with customer service, been reaching out to our customers, discussing their balances, setting up payment programs and the like. So I think we've significantly decreased that outstanding amount due to Belmont Light, but there is kind of our top 20 customers, if you will, that it's a significant portion of our uncollectibles. They are protected customers, and we're trying to find all ways of working with them to to mitigate that and clean that up. Going back a little bit to, I think you mentioned our G&A being a little bit higher. We are looking at modifying and adjusting the business to have future personnel that we need here in the business. I can tell you that we had a recent retiree who was doing our utility locating for us. That was his only duty, I guess, and there was a lot of waste, if you will, with that person's time and what we could do better. So we have modified that job description to allow more flexibility, in that to do other tasks. So that goes into the G&A as well, as far as that position being unfilled at the moment.
Thanks.
Steve?
Yeah, I know we're running out of time. Just quickly, Craig, I assume this budget does provide for continuation of the system upgrades, the changeover from the 4 kV to 13 8 kV system, and the eventual decommissioning of the 3 small substations we have in town.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, there is our construction fund, if you will, exists with right now plenty of revenue in there for us to, or money in there for us to move forward, continue for several years here, continuing to meet that goal.
Okay, and I think I read that the changeover from in the street lights to all LEDs is scheduled to be completed this year.
Yes, we were, last I checked in with operations, we were about the 70% mark with our conversion project from the high pressure sodium streetlights to the LED streetlights. So unfortunately for us, it's an expense, but for the town, it's certainly a reduction in their electric bill to us. So, but yes, we're well on track. We'll finish that this year.
Okay, yeah, well, it's a carbon positive for us, so thank you. That's it for me.
Any other committee comments or questions? Craig, thank you. Maria, thank you. I think that we took away the big point, which is there seems to be a structural deficit that we'll have to handle.
Yeah, and I
or
would
the
say
next board
just
will have
that,
to handle.
yeah, and just as a point, if anyone, if you go back to, I think it was our December meeting, I would suggest anyone kind of look back through the 5-year projection from MWIC, because they did a very good job, I think, of explaining what these future years look like coming up. And to Mike's point, even though this year is a spike higher, we expected it to be higher this year. We didn't expect the gas prices to go where they went, but we did expect a higher budget this year, and then it drop off next year and then come back up. And so they do a really good job of explaining that, I think. So that could be helpful to a lot of people.
Great. General Manager, we don't need to spend a lot of time on Chenery, just so you know.
Yeah.
We've got, but maybe I know the high school might be a longer conversation, so.
Yep, and I think Sam's on the call. I'll let him speak to it. He's been, as you all know, he's been working this job for well over a year, so I'll let him provide any good news or not.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So the good news is that the system was re-inspected and approved for operation last week. Started generating last Wednesday, which is obviously great news. I had a site meeting yesterday with the Sunbug Solar project manager to go over some of the details of the installation. However, during the site visit, it became apparent that the system has stopped generating for unknown reasons. So that there's some troubleshooting that needs to be done right now. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that still on the to-do list is to connect the display that the technology department, so Steve Mazzola's group, provided. They ran a piece of Cat6 cable from the electrical room to the front of the building, and there is no connectivity as of yet. But that's hopefully going to change in the next few days, along with the troubleshooting of why the system isn't generating. So that would be all.
So close.
Not generating because it's covered in snow, right?
No, actually, that was
Joking.
no, that was sort of something I said too, but no, we could not figure out ourselves yesterday why it wasn't generating. So we're gonna have an electrician on site soon.
Just curious, is there a monitoring contract, or is there who will know when a panel goes out? Is that a Belmont Light thing or a Sunbug Solar thing or someone else?
So Sunbug Solar will be sort of free and clear once the project is done of that duty. So the display in the front of the building will show when the system isn't monitoring. There's also going to be a login into the system. So the credentials for that will be provided to us also in the coming days. And I can make that available, obviously, to us and to the facilities group as well as the school department, so that we can make sure that the system is up and running.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like maybe this is a good segue to the high school, but if we've got some panels on our municipal buildings, there ought to be someone looking them over periodically. I know 10% of my solar array was dysfunctional recently, and I don't know how long it was dysfunctional. So anyway.
Yeah, so I've been talking to the facilities director, David Blazon, about this. And the plan was to have a little sort of training session with Sunbug Solar to make sure that we're all aware of how the system works and what to look out for. But like I said, it kind of went south yesterday, given the issues we were encountering. So, and we do have some, just the other thing of note, there's some spare modules in the electrical room that will be stored, at the Chenery school for now, in case something goes wrong with the modules that are up there now.
Great, thank you. Thank you
You're
again
welcome.
for all the work. Craig, do you want to talk about high school solar?
Yes, so I may have caused more of a ruckus by putting this on the agenda than I intended, but from what I understood, there was conversation in the community about the high school project and the solar on the high school, and Belmont Light maybe being involved in it. And so I didn't want to ignore that. That's why this is on the agenda. It was really just to address, I guess, the elephant in the room, if you will. But I can tell you, I was asked to attend a meeting with some of the town folks in government to discuss what, if anything, Belmont Light could or would do to assist with the high school solar project. I don't have all you probably, as citizens, you probably have a better knowledge of the high school project than I do, but they were looking at mitigating some possible cost overruns, and they were looking at different options, different ways of doing that. At the end of that meeting, I can tell you that the town is committed to building solar on the high school as designed for the high school and the town's purpose, not for Belmont Light or the ratepayers' purpose. So really at this point, all that had happened was we looked at this at a high level as a light department. We would we would be happy to get involved if need be to keep the project moving forward. But at this point, it doesn't appear that the town needs or is not really looking for us to be involved in it. So there's not much more out to report out than that. And that's all I wanted to do. My point of putting this was just to address that. Yes, we had a discussion, but by no means did that mean that we were taking over or in place of the town running this project. It's still a town project. It's still with the building committee. It'll still be, my understanding is it's still going to be built as part of the overall project.
That's pretty clear to me. Thank you for the update. I do appreciate that it's on the agenda because I've heard rumors about all of this and trying to follow the high school solar situation also. And I know John, who has his hand up, has also been involved. So John.
Thank you, Craig. I think that's a great summary and discussion update. One comment I have is that it may come up later in terms of whether or not Belmont Light is going to extend the current net metering policy to include the high school. So I just wanted to put that out there. And your predecessor had indicated that it was when the project was still in its early, the high school solar project was still in its early stages, that was something that Belmont Light would look into, that he personally supported and would move through the appropriate process as necessary.
John, could you just be a little more clear about like what because I know you've done some financial models of the high school. What do those models assume as far as metering, net metering goes?
It assumes that the current net metering policy, aka net metering light, would apply to the high school, where it would get the approximately 11 cents per kilowatt hour for any net exports.
And the opposite, the alternative would just be zero, is what you're.
I mean, the alternative
is anything but 11
it's
cents.
Zero or wholesale.
Okay.
I mean,
you're worried, but
something else.
you're worried that currently there's no, because it's the town, we don't have a precedent for how any power put it back on from the school would be handled, and that you're advocating for, or the financial model you ran was 11 cents. Is that right?
That's correct. It's
okay.
It's basically the same net metering policy that current solar project owners receive.
Okay, Craig, do you want to comment on that now?
Yeah,
I can say one quick. Oh,
go ahead,
Becca.
Becca.
sorry, Craig. I was just going to say the current tariff allows for arrays up to 1.5 megawatts. It was updated intentionally to allow for this facility. So I think, John, I'm not sure, but I think the current array is going to be around 1.3 megs. So it would fit under this tariff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Up.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
No, I think that covers it. So thank you.
No, that covers it. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to go to Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, the town voters voted this Belmont High School, middle school project to include solar panels. And I think those solar panels should be the responsibility of the town to put up. I don't want to say that Belmont Light shouldn't be supportive, but Belmont Light shouldn't be viewed as a piggy bank by the town to do things that the town should be doing on its own.
Thank you. I'll just second that. I think in particular, the first part about the town voted to bond the project, including the solar, and there's a reason it made a lot more sense when with the bond rate that we went out to finance a solar project. So anything else I think is going to change the economics quite a bit, including Belmont Light's involvement. Was some of that at least mentioned? Are the people you met with, Craig, aware of all of that?
I believe so, yes, I do. I think it was just an idea. This is just my opinion, my take, but it was just an idea that was floated that was never really vetted or thought through all the ins and outs. And when we sat down and had that discussion, it was clear that it wasn't the right approach.
Okay.
My-
I'm going to let Brian, you talk, but please keep it short just because we are running so long. So go ahead.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. Just to let you know, having been in a bunch of meetings, select board, building committee, et cetera, those folks are still really floating the possibility of Belmont Light coming in to save the day. So I don't think it's really been, the stake has not been put in the heart of that alternative funding idea. So you may hear it coming up again, unfortunately.
Thank you. Well, Craig, maybe you can take a sentiment of at least this body says that it's a bad idea. But
Yeah.
I mean, excuse me, I guess that's only two of us that have expressed that at the top, but yeah. But I think we can move on to recent outages. And this can
Yes.
also be short, so.
Yes, this will be quick. So let me get the dates right for you. We had two outages. on
February
the same-
6th and January 29th.
Yes. So they were the same circuit. So the morning of that nor'easter that we had, that snowstorm. And then for whatever reason, this is pretty common, and I can't explain it, even being in the utility business now for 25 years, but you can have a heavy wind day, heavy blizzard conditions, and underground cables tend to fault. I don't know why, but it happens all the time. So anyways, the morning of the snowstorm that we had, we did have an outage on one of our circuits in the Cushion Square area. And we went out there, it has a combination of overhead load, underground load. We went out there, we patrolled the overhead because we would have expected that, you know, in a snowstorm, that could be a reason for a circuit to open up. And we found no issues. So we were able to restore customers just under an hour on that circuit by doing what we call field switching, picking up the load on other circuits in the overhead. We went back, we tested the underground system. The underground tested okay, tested good. So we basically put the circuit back together, put it back in service, and went about our day. But approximately a week later, the circuit went out again. In the meantime, we had put what we call fault indicators on the overhead. So what they do is they'll give us some information on whether or not the issue that caused the circuit to open up was either in the overhead circuitry or in the underground circuitry. And so the second time it happened, those fault indicators indicated it was in the underground system. So again, we were able to quickly switch the customers in the overhead via field switching. And then we tested the underground circuit. The underground did test bad at that moment. We were able to figure out that we had a problem there in the underground system. So that total restoration was just over an hour. So both of them were just on average about an hour's worth of time. We had a cable fault. We removed this 2 sections of cable, pulled in new cable, and have that all spliced back up and put back in service. So we don't suspect that we'll have any long-term or any future issues on that circuit, but like any other circuit, there's plenty of cable that that could have issues in the future. So it's just kind of one of those things where, for whatever reason, snowstorms tend to cause problems with underground cables, and I can't explain it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to the team for letting me do my coffee on those mornings, getting service back on. So thank you.
I will say, and I'd be remiss not to thank the operations team that responded to the outage the morning of the snowstorm. It was right as the storm was really taking off, about 8:30 in the morning when it happened. And they were out there switching in those conditions, wind, snow. They tested the cable in those conditions. They really just worked it as if it was a normal day in those conditions. That was impressive. When you think about the snow on the ground, plows out there trying to plow, us trying to get to the underground manholes and do all that type of work. My hat's off to them. They did, I think, a fabulous job of really restoring that circuit as quickly as they did on that particular day.
Thank you.
Greg, I know those guys are just doing their jobs, but it does warrant some amount of, that's a hard job to do. And I think, you know, whatever we can do going forward to give them the accolades they deserve for that kind of performance, because not only is reliable power great, but it's wonderful when the power stays on. And those are the conditions you need it the most. So I think, you know, whatever they're doing, keep doing, and you know, whatever we can do to let them know that the town appreciates that kind of work is I think essential to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'll pass on the word of the committee to them and just reiterate it. I thank them, you know, obviously right away, but I'll certainly pass on that. The feeling is mutual from the committee's point of view.
Aiden, are we coming back to approve minutes and do a public session, or are we approving them?
I think so too. Vote approval of the minutes that will be discussed at in executive session.
So I guess, are we returning to a public? We are going to return to a public session. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I would entertain a motion to discuss trade secrets or confidential, competitively sensitive, or other proprietary information. Do I hear so moved from someone?
So moved.
And a second.
Second,
I saw Alex seconded first, so I think we need to vote. And that would be Travis Frank, aye. John?
John Abe, aye.
Steve?
C. Clancy, aye.
Michael?
Michael McCray, aye.
Bob?
Bob Forrester, aye.
Alex?
Alex Van Giel, aye.
Dave?
Dave Evers, aye.
I think I got everyone. Okay, so we will move to executive session and be back upon completion. I move to come out of executive session.
Second.
Okay, Travis Frank, aye. Bob?
Bob Forrester, aye.
Steve? I saw his lips. Dave?
Dave Evers, aye.
Michael?
Michael McCray, aye.
Steve, go ahead, just for the record.
Steve Clancy, aye.
Okay, great. And then the last agenda item, and I apologize for going so long today, but we did, I maybe could have sped Dave up, but is the meetings. We have March 23rd is listed, and you want to potentially move.
Travis,
Yep.
I'm sorry to jump in.
Oh,
you
minutes
have
for
January
minutes.
12th. Yeah,
Yeah.
minutes.
Thank you. So we have the minutes from January 12th for this public session of LBAC. Do we have any edits or comments? This is the Ventana research. This was our evening presentation. This is our. Looks good to me. So I move to adopt the minutes from January 12th, 2022.
Second.
Second,
Okay, Travis Frank, aye. Bob? Bob, do you have a vote? Oh, he might be frozen. Steve?
Steve Clancy, aye.
Dave?
Dave Evers, aye.
Michael? I believe that was an aye, but you're muted.
Muted.
Michael McCray, aye.
Okay, we're getting there. So I think that was, we'll maybe count Bob as abstain for the moment until he comes back. He just dropped off. We still do have a quorum though. And now we need to talk about dates. So the topic is potentially the light board meeting was moved ahead a week to March 22nd, 21st. So we would potentially move our date from the 23rd of March to the 16th of March. I could do that.
Actually, I have a conflict on the 16th.
Okay.
I could do the 15th or the 17th, but I couldn't do the 16th. At least at a 7:30 a.m.
The 17th I cannot do, so I would do the 15th. How does that sound for everyone?
March 15th works for me, 7:30.
Okay, let's change that. And I move to adjourn the meeting. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Travis Frank, aye. Steve?
Steve Flansky, aye.
Michael?
Michael McCray, aye.
Dave?
Dave Beavers, aye.
And who am I missing? Sorry, maybe that's, oh, Bob, you're back.
Of course.
Sorry. Great. So Bob, just in case you didn't hear, we're now meeting on the 15th of March.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Sorry that we went so long.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Travis.
Thank
Craig.
you. Thanks very much.
Maria, back up. Aiden.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye.